talk too much about it actually, and in good spiritual warfare you need to know your enemy well in order to defeat it. So we're going to discuss the false ego today, and we're going to speak on a verse from Bhagavad Gita as it is, chapter 3, text 27. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 So the verse is Prakritehe kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvashaha ahankara vimudhatma kartaham iti manyate. You can repeat the Sanskrit after me. Prakritehe kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvashaha ahankara vimudhatma kartaham iti manyate. And the translation is, the spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by the three modes of material nature. So you can repeat the translation as well. The spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by the three modes of material nature. So read the purport by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki. Two persons, one in Krishna consciousness and the other in material consciousness, working on the same level, may appear to be working on the same platform, but there is a wide gulf of difference in their respective positions. The person in material consciousness is convinced by false ego that he is the doer of everything. He does not know that the mechanism of the body is produced by nature, which works under the supervision of the Supreme Lord. The materialistic person has no knowledge that ultimately he is under the control of Krishna. The person in false ego takes all credit for doing everything independently, and that is the symptom of his nescience. He does not know that this gross and subtle body is the creation of material nature, under the order of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and as such, his bodily and mental activities should be engaged in the service of Krishna in Krishna consciousness. The ignorant man forgets that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is known as Rishikesh, or the master of the senses of the material body, for due to his long misuse of the senses and sense gratification, he is factually bewildered by the false ego, which makes him forget his eternal relationship with Krishna. Om Gyanatminandasya Gyananginashalakaya Chakshuran Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Bhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhuttade Swayam Rupakadam Mahyam Nadati Swapadantikam Ma'am Vishnu Vidaya Krishna Pristaya Bhuttade Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastrati Deshtharini Vanchaka Putrubhyascha Kripasanyapi Evacha Titanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavyo Namo Namaha. So in this verse, Krishna is speaking of three factors in particular. So he's speaking of the soul, he's speaking of the material nature, he's speaking of the ego. So we are a little more conversant with what the soul is. Krishna describes in the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita quite a lot about it. We know that the soul is eternal, full of knowledge and bliss, that the soul is actually, in reality, who we are. The soul is situated in the region of the heart, and that we actually need to be engaged in spiritual activities to free the soul of the cycle of birth and death. But about the false ego, we know a little less about. So what the false ego actually is an energy of Krishna. And Krishna states this in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 7, text 14, when he says, earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego, altogether these 8 constitute my separated material energies. So if it's the energy of Krishna, why is it so bad, and why does it affect our relationship with him? So we remember that we came to this material world in order to be controllers. We wanted to be in charge, independent of Krishna. The problem is we can't provide an environment for ourselves. We're incapable of that. So Krishna has to provide an environment for us, and that environment is created of material elements. For spiritual elements to pervade, there must be devotional service, but we're not in that consciousness. We're in that consciousness of wanting to be masters. So the material elements are what constitutes the material nature. So this is what these 8 elements all together make up. So we're a little more familiar with the 5 gross elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. And we know that in combination, those 5 elements are forming everything in this room and our material bodies, which we're very aware of. But we don't know where the false ego is exactly. So I was thinking about an example that we can use. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with what Russian dolls are. Okay, so a Russian doll looks like this. Okay. So it's basically a series of dolls, and one fits into the other and fits into the other.
It's blank, Manji.
It's
blank.
Sorry. This is about as technical as I can get. Okay. Matryoshka dolls. So the smallest one fits into the one bigger than that, and then fits into the next one, fits into the next one, and then we have this whole series of dolls that fit into each other. So in the same way, our mind, intelligence, and false ego, they form a subtle body that is actually fitted within this material body, and the soul is within the subtle body. So they're almost like in layers like this, and just draw it quickly. Okay, so material body, gross body, subtle body inside, and this is where the mind, intelligence, and false ego are. And inside there is the soul. But the soul, although we know it's very tiny according to what Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, the soul actually has an identity. But this identity is dormant right now. So I'm going to mark it with like a dotted line. But it has an absolute identity of its own, a body, we could say, of its own that's completely spiritual. So this body right now is inactive, the spiritual form. And so the soul actually has no interface with which it can relate to the material world. So in order to have an interface, the subtle body is there. And the false ego then gives its personality to that soul, so the soul can interact with the material world. The problem is that the soul believes that it is that false ego, and it's conducting itself completely from that. So take Paramatma Prabhu. So Prabhu has a complete personality that's based on everything he knows, but all of that came from his past karma, and it's being enacted by his false ego. And that's like that for all of us. But inside, he has an identity. And that identity could be completely different. It could be a manjari, right? A maidservant of Radha and Krishna in Vrindavan. And that is a completely different identity. So we could ask then, why can't he just like wake up his identity? So it's not that easy, because in the material world, all of our identities are based on the fact that we want to be masters. And the identity that comes to us from the spiritual world, this identity that we really are, that is an identity of being a servant of Krishna. And it can't exist in an environment that's entirely based on being a master. So in the material world, the false ego acts as a proxy for that soul in order to orientate us at least to this place. But the problem is that, like I was saying, we identify with the false ego, and we think that everything that the false ego wants for us is what we want for us. So we can take another example. We can take an example of a phone. So the phone is the material body. And the phone has a battery. The battery is the soul, because the battery is providing current, which is life force, and is providing consciousness, basically, to this whole unit. But the problem is that the soul can't interface with the rest of the world. It's just providing current. So what does happen is we have the operating system, which is our mind, intelligence, and false ego, that run this entire body, that run all the apps. And some apps are pre-installed, like family and health and other things. And some apps get added, like work and school and education, further education and things like that. So the false ego is so busy concerning itself with all of these apps that it's not realizing that the current is running down. And when the current is finished, we don't get a recharge. So that's the problem. The false ego is distracting us so much. So it's not all bad, it's helping us run this body, but it's distracting us because it thinks that this body is for us. It's not trying to engage this body in Krishna's service and what it's actually meant for. So we would think that some desires are not all bad. Some desires are in the mode of goodness, and mode of passion and mode of ignorance are the ones that are not bad, not good. So this brings us to the modes. So that's the third factor. We've already discussed the soul and we've discussed the false ego. So now we're coming to the modes of nature. So the modes of nature, Krishna describes quite extensively in the Bhagavad Gita. Actually, the three, they're also like elements, we could say, but they're sort of like moods. We could think of it as moods. The Sanskrit name is gunas, qualities. But we could think of it as a mood that actually has the ability to create. So it's not like what we think. Like sometimes we think that mode of nature means like Mother Nature, and it means like trees and plants and things like that. But it's actually not. It means nature of a thing. So we have three modes, and that's goodness, and we have passion, and we have ignorance. And these three modes have the ability to actually create everything that is needed by the souls in this material world. They're actually the ones doing it. And that's why Krishna says that the soul thinks that it's doing everything, but it's actually not. So who's the actual user of this phone? It's not the soul. It's goodness, passion, and ignorance. So the person who is in ignorance is a little bit crazy and uses the apps for things that someone in ignorance would use it for. It's lethargic, in darkness, doesn't care too much about stuff. The one in passion is trying to get everything done, generally too fast. And the one in ignorance, the one in goodness, is trying to use everything for good, right? So these three modes are basically then an extension of the false ego. Like Srimad Bhagavatam explains how in the process of creation this happens. So Canto 2, Chapter 5, Text 24 says, the self-centered materialistic ego, thus being transformed into three features, becomes known as the modes of goodness, passion, and ignorance in these three divisions. So these three entities of goodness, passion, and ignorance, they're actually like extensions of the false ego meant for carrying out the desires that the soul has. Only the soul doesn't have those desires. Those desires are coming from the false ego, which itself is situated in goodness, passion, or ignorance. But the soul thinks that those desires are what's coming from it, and so it gives the energy to those desires being fulfilled by the false ego by virtue of just thinking that it belongs to it. Do I have everybody with me so far? I know it's a little bit context, but it's nice to understand what Krishna is teaching us in this verse, so we can understand how we can act more consciously. So, just to recap then, the soul doesn't have any way for carrying out its desires that are coming actually from the false ego. So the modes are carrying out those desires, but the problem is that the modes are just automatically doing it. They can't do it anything on their own. They're doing it as an extension of the soul. So therefore, any consequence of the actions of the modes come to the soul. That's how the soul gets all the karma, not the modes. They can't. They're just carrying out under the order of Krishna. Like we read, the modes are all under the order. Everyone's under the order of Krishna, because ultimately even he gives sanction to the desires of the soul. So we can then ask again that, well, maybe if we're situated in goodness, what's so bad about having desires? So Krishna explains in Bhagavad Gita in the 2nd chapter that as soon as we start contemplating on things, we create a series of events that leads to more entanglement in the material world, even if it's in goodness. So that contemplation leads to maybe unintended consequences. It leads to situations that we may get more entangled in, and this goes on until we actually increase our duration in this material world by being reborn to fulfill all these karmas. So even acting in the mode of goodness is not good. We need to act above it. And the problem in this day and age, in particular in this Kali Yuga, is that we're not even acting in goodness. To be acting in goodness, Krishna says, it means we should at least know what ought to be done and what not to be done. But basically all of us are thinking about what is good for us based on our false ego. We're not actually considering situations on what's right and what's wrong. And that's actually not even really being situated in the conscience, but being more in the subconscious. And that's a dangerous place to be, because that's where fear and anger and other emotions are. And so we see the tendency in this day and age is that people are acting on reflex from these behaviors, because they're actually acting from the subconscious. They're not even aware that what they're doing is wrong. They just think it's right for me. So that's a problem in a world of relativity, where my false ego wants me to be in control and yours wants you to be in control, and they don't agree with each other because there's relative good and bad, relative right and wrong. In the spiritual world, there's one absolute will, and that is Krishna's. And so there's no need for the false ego, and therefore there's none of these situations like what we have in the material world. So basically we're all trying to endeavor, though, to get above the false ego by two means, which is basically both based in intelligence. Because if we use our intelligence to consider a situation and act in the right way rather than the way the false ego is directing us, then we will at least be able to achieve some measure of success in having a relatively peaceful life. So the problem is that even if we're using our material intelligence to do that, it's not always right in all situations. It's still relative. This is a world of relativity. So that brings us to the second level of intelligence, which we need to cultivate, and that's spiritual intelligence. So there was another very famous devotee who was in that position like we can fall into, Arjuna. So Arjuna was trying to reason out his fighting or not fighting based on basically the mode of goodness, right? And Krishna explained to him that it's not an absolute state that you can judge every situation from. And that is what many of the discussions are about. But if you act in spiritual intelligence, and that spiritual intelligence is called buddhi, if you act in spiritual intelligence, then that is the absolute right in all circumstances. So this spiritual intelligence is cultivated by buddhi yoga, and Srila Prabhupada explains what buddhi yoga is. This is, he actually quotes Bhagavad Gita chapter 10, text 10. Dadami buddhi yogam tam yena mam upayanti te. That's Krishna speaking. And he's explaining that as the supersoul, we have direct communion with him in the heart, and that's how we get the intelligence to know what is correct in all circumstances, what is right and how to live. And that direct communion is very possible for all of us. It's that sense of inner knowing, and it is, as we said, real spiritual intelligence. So when we're acting in just the material intelligence, we sort of, for example, if we're doing devotional service, we know we're doing the service, but to actually realize that service and how to do it in that properly spiritual way, that is buddhi. So Srila Prabhupada says about this, that simply to understand that God is seated in everyone's heart is not perfection. So that's just the understanding. We need to be acquainted with God from within and without, and thus act in Krishna consciousness. So that acquaintance is what we need to develop. So let's take another example to help us understand what it means. So you remember the pastime of Damodar Leela, right? When Mother Yashoda was feeding Krishna, and then she had to put him down, and she had to take the milk off the stove. So the milk was boiling over, and Krishna was very upset that she left him one side. So if we use our intelligence and our knowledge as well of matters, but we answer from false ego, let's try. How many think that Mother Yashoda did the right thing by leaving Krishna one side and attending to the milk? How many hands think that it was the right thing to do? And how many think that the right thing to do was to carry on feeding Krishna? So these are our choices based on what we know. That's a choice that's based on our false ego and our sense of experiences. But Mother Yashoda's buddhi yoga told her to go and take the milk off the stove, because she understood, again, because of her direct communion with the Supersoul, that milk is a devotee. That milk is a devotee of Krishna, because in the spiritual world, everything is conscious. So as a devotee, the milk was thinking, our acharyas tell us this, the milk was thinking that if Maria Yashoda continued to feed Krishna her milk, it wouldn't get an opportunity to serve Krishna. So the milk was trying to kill itself. It's very cute. So the poor milk was boiling over in that way, and Maria Yashoda went to save the devotee and left aside God. And in spiritual life, that's actually kind of what you're supposed to do. You always serve the devotee over the Lord. That's how you get the mercy of the Lord. But who's going to work this out without buddhi? So this is what we're actually trying to cultivate in spiritual life. That sense of absolute knowing, that inner knowing of everything. In a crude sense, in the material world, we call it the intuition. But it's more than that. It's actually much deeper. And we do it through devotional service. Srila Prabhupada explains in chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita and in chapter 10 that devotional service is the way that we cultivate buddhi. So the thing is just that in the meantime, when we're acting, we're performing our devotional services to develop buddhi, before we get to that stage, we have to be more conscious of what we're doing because we're still in the modes. And the modes can infiltrate our devotional service. Lord Kapila explains this to Madhudeva Huti in Canto 3, chapter 29. So we can actually do devotional service in the modes, and that's not what we want. So before we develop buddhi, we need to at least develop our intelligence, guided by spiritual knowledge. Like we said, knowledge is key to that. So we can increase our consciousness of what we're doing until our devotional service is pure enough to grant us that buddhi that we are needing so much. So basically we're trying to overcome this tendency we have to act in the subconscious and do everything, even our services, the way we do everything else in the world under the influence of the modes, so that those services can be more pleasing to the Lord. So we take another example. When we walk through the door, what's the first thing that we do? We offer our obeisances, right? So it's actually quite an unconscious thing if we think about it, because we're not considering the process of offering obeisances. I didn't actually think about what I was doing until His Holiness Bhakti Chaitanya Maharaj was giving a class, and he was explaining the different types of obeisances. So there's an obeisance that's called the jackknife, where you kind of like get down and get up very quickly. And I was doing the jackknife for many years without realizing it until I heard from Maharaj. And then the effect of that was, of course, to make me think about how to offer obeisances properly. So then we had the good fortune of doing the Vaishnava etiquette course with His Grace Raghunath Das Prabhu, and he was guiding us from there, and doing some more readings about Srila Prabhupada. Now I have a consciousness of how to offer obeisances. I know from the course that females offer obeisances with the 5 points of the body, right? The head, the hands, the elbows, the knees, and the feet. That we offer obeisances with both hands and nothing in the hands. That we chant the pranam mantra, not like very loudly, but at least audibly, because Srila Prabhupada wanted that. And we offer obeisances with our left side facing the Lord, because this is where our soul is. We're offering that to Him in that obeisance. And that whole experience of hearing from Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra has meant that now I'm doing this more consciously. So it may not yet be on the level of buddhi, it's very far from it, but it's at least on the level of goodness, or closer to goodness. And goodness is very close to buddhi, right? It's the level below at least. It's pulling me out of being unconscious and passion and ignorance, because I don't know which mode I was in when I was offering obeisances before, but at least now it's getting closer to where I want to be. So we could say, of course, that the way I was offering obeisances is better than nothing, but the point is it could be better. So this is what we're aiming for. We need to keep being better. We need to keep rising above these modes, basically rising above the false ego. So we also need to be conscious of how we relate to devotees. That's the next thing we do. Master said we greet, but sometimes we don't greet. Sometimes we think it doesn't matter. But in devotional service, we are taught that to be, relating to God better than we relate to the devotees actually makes us a third-class devotee. I don't know about all of you, but when I was growing up, we called it third class was a very bad thing. So none of us wants to be a third-class devotee. We have to learn how to relate to all the devotees appropriately, those above us, those on our level, those who are junior to us. And that actually makes us progress. And even more so than just devotees, we actually have to know how to relate to everyone, because Lord Kapila says in the third canto that he is in everyone's heart and we shouldn't discriminate amongst anyone. And what to speak of anyone but anything, because the super soul is present in all objects. So we have this tendency sometimes unconsciously to move something with our feet, but the super soul is in that object. So we see how unconsciously we're making offenses like that. So the other thing that we have to be very conscious of is chanting. Chanting is actually the most important aspect of devotional service, but I can tell you that many times I'm thinking about all kinds of other stuff when I'm chanting, and even when someone's leading kirtan, it's like, who's singing, why are they singing? Or even when someone is speaking, because speaking is also chanting. So when our mind is distracted, we're not giving attention to that sound, and sound is such an important factor in this world. Srimad Bhagavatam guides us to how. In chapter 5, Canto 2, chapter 5, text 25, it says that from the darkness of false ego comes the 5 elements. And the first of those 5 elements is the sky, and from the sky comes sound, and from sound comes all the other elements. So sound is actually the first thing. It's the basis of all the elements in this material world. So if we think about in this material world, then with the false ego, that consciousness of us and being master is pervading. The spiritual world has the consciousness of Krishna being master and pervading. And here, from that consciousness of us being master, we have the sound of material things. And in the spiritual world, from that consciousness of Krishna being master, we have the sound of the holy name. So just by an adjustment of consciousness, moving away that false ego, by paying attention at least, we don't have buddhi yet, but we can at least pay attention. You move that aside and you have transcendental sound, and you are situated in that transcendental sound, even though you're in the material world. That's how effective it actually is to just pay attention. And it's something that we miss, right, very often. So His Holiness Nrsimha Swami Maharaj actually says that it's the sound that conditions us, but it's also the sound that liberates us, if we're paying attention. So the next thing is prasadam. And by now we've gathered it mustn't be for one's taste, right? Because that's obviously in false ego. If we're wanting everything to go according to the way I want it to go according to it, it's false ego. So it's a test when we come. We don't think of it like that, but it's a test. When we come and we're faced with prasadam that we don't like, or that's not made the way I like it, or it's mixed with things I don't like, that's a test of our false ego. That's not something that we can actually complain about, because it's relative. It's relative to what I want or what I like. So we need to be conscious of these tests, because many come in spiritual life. We think sometimes that when we come to spiritual life, everything must just be peaceful. But if it's all peaceful, the false ego is just going to stay the way it is. But it needs to be constantly challenged, because we can see now how much of it is going on and we're just not aware of it. So with all these tests, Krishna is actually communicating with us, like, how far are you making progress in your spiritual life and your awareness of me? Now, some things are not so straightforward like that. Some things are a little more straightforward than my way. Some things are on an absolute level bad, right? So if somebody came here and they're smoking, that's bad. Okay, you don't need that. You don't need to be in your false ego. You don't bring it up though in your false ego. You bring it up because it's in Shastra, because it's something that Guru, Sadhu, Shastra, your authorities agree on. That's the correct thing. So that's what is quite clear, but it's absolutely wrong. And when things are more subtle, then we inquire from our authorities. That's what we have the authorities for. They're to help us to navigate the subtleties of when we're not sure whether it's like a false ego thing, whether it's a Shastra thing that I'm not interpreting right, and so on. So we depend on those authorities. So Srila Prabhupada said in a letter that we should use our common sense, and if we don't have it, ask someone who has common sense. Okay, so that should be what we try and do in our spiritual life, so that we always do the right thing. And the other thing that helps us with prasadam is prasadam prayers. So the prasadam prayers are a meditation, that when I am taking prasadam, I'm honoring it in a prayerful way rather than eating it to my satisfaction. So it's nice to read the translation of these prayers so that we can meditate on that. So before we eat, we don't make those offenses to the prasadam. And what I found interesting is that we don't recite those prasadam prayers. It's a bit technical. We don't recite those prasadam prayers on Ekadasi. And the reason why is because in those prayers, the translation says that we after we offer our respects to the prasadam, we take to our full satisfaction, and on Ekadasi, we don't take anything to our full satisfaction. The reason why is because we're trying to decrease our ego, and we're trying to increase our consciousness of Krishna. So in Ekadasi, our prasadam is generally a little more simple. And then that brings us to our consciousness of Ekadasi, because most times there's a bit of a groan or a moan that it's Ekadasi again, and I've got to find something to cook. But the problem is that we're missing the opportunity to please Krishna and be in consciousness of something that pleases him, because it's all about challenging the false ego and how I want to eat what I want to eat tomorrow instead of eating grains. But if we're always trying to be more conscious of him, then he helps us to do that. He actually helps those efforts of consciousness because he's within. That's why we kind of can't bluff him with trying to do things in a certain way, because he actually knows what we are conscious of more than we are conscious of it. This is also the motivation behind the 4 rules, because those 4 rules are there because we don't have to indulge in those activities. We indulge in them out of false ego. It's desire. And Krishna wants us to obviously get out of desire, so he tells us not to do it, so we don't do it because we're in consciousness of him and what pleases him. Our dress, when we come to spiritual functions, we're dressed in a way that increases our consciousness of the Lord. Sometimes we can let the modes interfere with it, and we're kind of proud that we dress nicely and in a spiritual way, which is, we can understand then, something we must be aware of and avoid by being conscious of it. In the same way that even when we take initiation, something that's supposed to make us more conscious of the Das or the Dasi at the end of the name, we're kind of more conscious of the first part of the name and we're a bit more proud. Right? So these are all subtleties that we need to be more aware of. Right? We wear these neck beads because Prabhupada said they are dog collar. They're supposed to increase our humility. They're supposed to increase our consciousness of the Lord and get us out of that ego consciousness. So another meditation every time we look at this. Coming to the Namahata, going to the temple, we're adjusting to schedules that we, in our false ego, may not be happy about. A lot of it actually comes down to that. We may not even have a schedule crisis, but sometimes it's just that we don't want to out of the false ego. And it's the same thing with services. We just don't like some services or we like others. But there's no spiritual basis to that. So by doing those services, we're actually challenging the false ego once again. And on the other hand, of course, doing too many services and trying to do services that are very high profile, it's the same problem. It's also more consciousness of us and less consciousness of the Lord. And then, of course, anyone who stays at home and says that God is in my heart, so I don't have to go to the temple, we understand now that he may be in our hearts, but he's not in our consciousness almost at all. So until we're in full consciousness of him, we have to come to the temple and come to the Namahata so that we're in an environment that is fully conscious of him. And then when we develop that full consciousness, when we're in Buddhi, then we can be anywhere and he's there with us. And the irony is then we'll want to be going to the temple. So from this we understand that there are a lot of subtleties to spiritual life and to consciousness. So Prabhupada advises us that until we get the Buddhi, we must depend on Guru, Sadhu and Sastra. So Guru is situated in the right consciousness. He's situated in the spiritual energy. So we need him to guide us so he can pull us into that energy as well. Right? It's one of the reasons why we offer our respects to Srila Prabhupada every week, because we are thanking him for keeping us in that energy, even though we probably realize now we're dangling a little by a thread. But it's his effort to make us conscious of all these things. So we'd be, again, more conscious when we're offering those flowers, to be grateful for him for that. And Guru Sadhu is very essential, the association of devotees. Srila Prabhupada created ISKCON for us to have that association, because association is so powerful, it can change our nature. That nature, Bhagavatam said, is given to us, of course, based on the modes and due to our karma by the Lord. And it's a very powerful thing. That nature has it, whatever nature we've all been given has us in its grip. But if we associate with devotees, His Holiness Ram Govinda Maharaj told me, good association and constant association, our natures can actually change. Who we are can change. There's not many other forces that can do that. Right? So association is so important, sadhu and sastra. We said that Srila Prabhupada wanted us to read his books. That knowledge is so important to improve our consciousness. But it's not to accumulate knowledge and not preach. Because accumulating knowledge is about as bad as accumulating material possessions. It's called Atyahara, and it's Rupa Goswami guides us about it in Nectar of Instruction. So we gather the knowledge to share that knowledge, and that this is what pleases Srila Prabhupada, and it helps us again to get out of the ego of just wanting that knowledge to be clever. So we've discussed quite a bit about becoming aware. We understand a bit more now how the modes cover our consciousness, and we understand a bit more about how the practices of Krishna consciousness are actually meant to help us to overcome that. So achieving that consciousness of Krishna is the absolute goal, and it may seem a bit daunting, so I'm apologizing if the class actually conveyed that impression, because we shouldn't feel that way. By becoming more conscious, it's helping us. If we're not more aware, then we're going to stay the way we are, and that's what we don't want. So His Grace Radhanath Bhatta Prabhu, I think he was here when he gave that analogy, it's very nice, that when you're cleaning, you're going to raise a lot of dust. If you don't start cleaning, you'll think there's no dust there. And then when you clean and all the dust is raised, then it's like, a little bit coughing, choking and whatever. But then gradually you continue and the dust gets cleared. So in the same way, when we're first aware of ourselves, we're getting more aware, it's quite like, whoa. But the point is, we become aware and then we make progress. We perform devotional services in the right way, we make progress. Krishna is always there within helping us, because even though we're not yet in buddhi, he's aware of us, right? And he's aware that we need the help. And the more sincere we are, sincerity is almost like a language we can communicate with him within. And the more we can awaken this consciousness in the right way. So we really want to do that. But we also don't want to be paranoid. So please, I'm not encouraging paranoia, right? My friend calls it analysis paralysis. So to overanalyze will put us more in consciousness of ourselves. We want to just be more attentive. Be more attentive in our chanting, be more attentive in our hearing, be more attentive in our practices. So there's tricks or tips we can employ. Like if you're doing cooking for the Lord, try to drown out the noise in the head and play some kirtan and actually listen to the kirtan like that. So we can do these things. It can help us practically, right? And we can be more deliberate, right? Be more careful. This is more situated in the mode of goodness. We can pause a bit before we get upset about something in particular, and try and think rather, what is the lesson that Krishna is trying to teach me? So that's like present moment awareness. My dear friend Kamini always reminds me of that. Present moment awareness. Okay, and His Holiness Bhakti Marg Swami, he was explaining that to be situated in the present and be aware, be more conscious of things is actually in the mode of goodness. To be in the past is the mode of ignorance, to be in the future is in the mode of passion, but to be in the mode of goodness is what, like we said, we're aiming for. This is our springboard for buddhi. So this is what we're making the efforts for. Otherwise, we're just going to stay the same and do the services in the same way we do everything, work, school, home. And His Holiness Niranjan Swami Maharaj was saying in a class that if everything stays the same, how do you expect that one day we're just going to wake up and see Krishna? Right? Something has to change. And these small changes, they're actually very significant changes, but they're small changes that we can make to help in this way. And this drawing again on Damodara Leela, it's the effort that we make and it's the mercy of the Lord. So there's those 2 inches on the rope that Mother Yashoda just could not bind Krishna with. And it's explained that whenever we're trying to do anything in Krishna consciousness, it's our effort and it's the mercy of the Lord. So we make the effort and the Lord definitely helps us. And like we said, we can always depend on Guru, Sadhu and Shastra and get their mercy and their guidance as well. So I'll leave you with these 5 potent forms of devotional service, very practical, that can help us in consciousness so much. Rupa Goswami advises us how to do that. And we have discussed some of them, right? One is chanting, and now we know very attentive chanting, that we're making the actual effort to hear the holy name. And the other is Shastra, particularly Srimad Bhagavatam. So we should try and reach Srimad Bhagavatam, or at least listen to a class, at least 1 class a day. Bhagavatam classes are generally not that long. It really helps, again, to situate us in the right consciousness. It helps to clear out our material contaminations. The third is association. We've explained how important that is. Then the other 2 forms are serving the deity and residing in the holy dham. So in serving the deity, it doesn't necessarily always mean working in the deity department, but serving the deity means actually going and having darshan of the Lord, admiring and appreciating him. It's actually so that if we witness an arti, it's like we're actually doing the art, we're getting the benefit for it. We preach more about the deity's beauty, we donate or we give something to the Lord, right? This, we've already established that every element here is not ours. Everything that we have has been provided for by the Lord so that we can wake ourselves out of this false ego and get to where we need to be. So we thank him by giving something back in some way. That's helping us in our consciousness, and of course serving or residing in the Dham is doing the same thing, because the Dham is the spiritual world. Even if we're not conscious of it, we know now why. We can still have it can still have a profound effect on us and help our consciousness to move in the right direction. We create a holy space within our homes as well, and we try to be more attentive and more focused in that when we're there. So these are the wonderful ways that we can try and overcome the false ego properly, so that we can really be in a humble state of mind and be more tolerant than a tree and devoid of all sense of false prestige. And then we can offer respects to others, and we can chant constantly and be in full consciousness of the Lord in complete buddhi. And this is attainable for everybody with the mercy of the Vaishnavas and Shri Guru, Shri Prabhupada and Lord Chaitanya. So thank you all so much for your kind attention, for bearing with me. I really appreciate the opportunity. Shri Prabhupada ki jai.